So today we're going to wrap up our discussion of political parties. We're going to talk about shifting of parties, different types of parties we've had over time, and some of the issues with having a two-party system. We talked last time about the role of parties in terms of things like elections, conventions, and so on. The reality is that today people are moving away from that party identification. It's not that people aren't identifying as Democrat or Republican, it's that there's less of a connection to the parties. That's because we don't have to rely on the parties to know how to vote. We have the internet, we have social media. We can find out anything we want to know on a candidate. In the 1950s, you were relying on the parties to give you more information. Today, we don't need them as much. Right? We don't need them to tell us which way to vote. We can do that on our own. And we are seeing more people starting to identify as independents. They're tired of the two-party system. They're tired of the non-competitive elections, the issues that we see in every election. They're tired of politics as usual. They want campaign reform. They want outside groups to be able to have a say in the government. And more people are identifying as independents. About 40% of Americans now identify as independents. In Arizona, 37% of voters are independents. That can make a difference in the upcoming Senate election. It's pretty close, and the Democratic candidate actually has a chance to win, which is unusual. Usually they don't have much of a shot. But this year, he does. In Colorado, 34% of voters are independents. On the other hand, if you are someone who votes on a regular basis, you are more likely to identify with a party. You're going to have stronger feelings on healthcare, abortion, Social Security, and so on. But if you're not someone who votes on a regular basis, then you can become an independent. You can be someone who just picks and chooses when they're going to vote or not. Independents can make or break an election. It depends on how the voters are feeling. In 2016, I didn't like the two candidates. They stayed home on election day. There's a little bit more motivation to vote this time, but it still depends on how they're feeling about the candidates. 2016 was an ugly election cycle. This year hasn't been much better. If independents stay home, then it depends which party shows up to vote. If independents do vote, it can make a difference in the outcome. So both parties are going to go after those independent voters hard. Also in Arizona, the candidate who's running is Mark Kelly, and his wife is former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, the Congresswoman who was shot in the head in 2011 and survived. She can no longer run for office, so her husband has decided he'd like to throw his hat in the ring. Okay, so our parties have shifted and changed and adapted over time. Washington didn't like the idea of political parties. He saw them as divisive. But the reality was there's always been division since the beginning. And the first divisions were the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Those who wanted a strong government and those who didn't. The Federalists were part of the movement for a strong government, constitution, and they tended to represent the New England merchants. They wanted a national bank, they wanted the war debts forgiven, they wanted a presidency, and they were the ones pushing for the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists represented the Southern planters, agriculturalists, who wanted free trade but didn't want a strong national government. So the original parties were basically pro-Constitution, anti-Constitution, and the Federalists ended up winning that fight. Later, we got the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs were never really a truly viable party. They were more united in their opposition to Democrats than they were on the issues. Their candidates would run based on their personal qualities rather than the issues. You can win one election by saying we don't like the opposition. It's not a supportable, sustainable party. It's not enough to dislike the other side. You have to have a clear message, a clear stance on the issues. They didn't end up lasting very long because there wasn't that much that brought them together. Then we saw the rise of the Republican Party before the Civil War. So it became Democrat versus Republican. Keeping in mind that this version of Democrat and Republican is very different from the one we see today. Democrats at the time were the party of segregation, of Jim Crow, of states' rights. They controlled the South, while Republicans favored integration and the end of slavery, were stronger in the North. So they were very different from the two parties that we see today. And sometimes the party that's not in power has to give up fighting and just join the other side. This happened to the Republicans with the New Deal. There was a huge amount of support for the New Deal programs, and they were working. So Republicans couldn't come up with a response to the New Deal, so they ended up joining the Democrats. They took the strategy of, if you can't beat them, join them. Right? We're not going to be able to come up with something better than the New Deal. FDR is popular, his policies are popular. If we want to stay in office, we're going to have to get on board with them. We can't run against this because it's not going to work. Throughout the Great Depression and World War II, Democrats really did dominate the national landscape. FDR was elected to 4 terms. He enjoyed a Democratic majority in Congress for most of that. So it was really a Democrat government for an extensive period of time. Okay, any questions so far? Any questions online? So, our contemporary party system is the result of radical shifts in the 1960s, 1970s. Democrats basically had a stranglehold on the South until the mid-1960s. Taxes used to be much higher. 1% would pay closer to 80% of their income in taxes. Goldwater was the first Republican. He was the presidential candidate for the Republicans in 1964 to run on the tax reduction policy to say taxes are too high. The government overregulates the economy. But he was able to get some support in the South because of that. Also, Nixon was able to bring in Southern whites who didn't like what they're seeing in the Democratic Party on issues like integration, women's liberation, and so on. And Ronald Reagan got evangelicals to join the Republican Party. They didn't like what they were seeing on abortion, affirmative action. They are not being allowed in schools. So they joined the Republican Party. Evangelical Christians basically voted en masse for Ronald Reagan and usually support Republican candidates. And Reagan was also able to bring in working class whites by talking about taxes, labor, and so on. Democrats, after the 1960s, began to bring in minority voters, have been seen as pro-union. FDR did favor the creation of labor unions, stricter labor laws, and so on. Democrats have tried to appeal to Americans concerned about abortion rights, LGBT rights, women's rights, the minimum wage, the environment, and so on. So we've seen the parties kind of shifting their attitudes over time. While there is a basic party platform, some representatives aren't always going to follow that platform. They may have to differ from their party because of the states they represent. So a Democrat in Georgia may need to be a little bit more conservative than the Democratic Party. A Republican in Massachusetts may be more liberal because the state is a bit more liberal. So they may support same-sex marriage. They may not oppose abortion. They may differ from the party because they know they can't be socially conservative in a liberal state or socially liberal in a conservative state, right? You gotta play with it a little bit. They're going to have to be a little different from the party, and usually the parties will understand that and at least make an exception for those who are trying to represent a more liberal or conservative state. The parties do inevitably change over time, and they will undergo periods of realignment. An electoral realignment is when a new party becomes dominant within the system. So President Lincoln being the first Republican president because of the anti-slavery movement and the march towards the Civil War. Democrats largely controlling Congress and the presidency during the New Deal. Americans were reluctant to change leaders when we just come out of a major economic downturn and we're heading into a global war. So FDR kept running and kept getting elected, and the Democrats kept dominating. And we've also seen changes through things like civil rights. Democrats traditionally were not the party of integration. We're not the party of civil rights. When Johnson became president after Kennedy was assassinated, it was assumed because he was a Southern Democrat, he wouldn't speak up on civil rights. So when he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we saw Democrats in the South leaving the party. So the North became solidly Democrat and the South became solidly Republican. And that was the last major realignment that we've had, is the post-1960s flipping of the electoral map, where Texas, Georgia, and other states used to be solidly Democrat, Illinois, Iowa, and others solidly Republican. Now it's switched around. We do also see a bit of a realignment when we see a divided government. If the presidency is controlled by one party and Congress by another, that's a divided government. So right now, Republicans control the White House and the Senate, Democrats control the House of Representatives. It's a bit of a shift because it sent a signal to the Republicans that people weren't exactly happy with business as usual, and making Democrats the majority party in the House of Representatives. And we tend to see a realignment occurring when there's an economic or social problem that weakens the ruling party. In 2008, because of the collapse of the economy, Republicans were targeted across the country and they lost the White House, and Democrats had control of both the House and the Senate. They were punished by the voters for the economic climate. So if there's something like an economic downturn, major protests like in the Vietnam War, or actually being at war, sometimes voters will blame the party in charge and then switch over to another party and say, you guys were in control for the last 8 years, but screwed up, so now we're switching sides and we're going to give this party the chance to run instead, see what they can do. to show you a quick example of how parties have changed over time. Found a copy of the Republican platform in 1946 when Eisenhower was re-election. Taking a look at this, we talk about dynamic and progressive programs. Assistance to workers with special employment problems, strengthening unemployment insurance, equal pay for equal work regardless of sex, strengthening 8-hour workday laws, minimum wage, continue to fight for the elimination of discrimination in employment because of race, creed, color, national origin, ancestry, or sex. If you were reading that and I didn't tell you which party's platform it was, which party do you think that would be today? I just showed you this and I didn't say which party it belonged to. Which party do you think this was attached to by today's standards? Democrats, right? We would look at this and we would think, oh, this is the Democratic Party platform. And by today's standards, it would be. But in the 1950s, the Republican Party was actually quite a bit more liberal. They were advocating for higher minimum wage, protection for workers, and so on. So it's an example of how parties can change, right? How we can see these changes happening within parties. Because some of that actually came out of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, and Richard Nixon signing things like Title IX in the early 1970s. So we've seen the parties changing quite a bit over the last half century. Of course, the parties are never 100% united. They're never going to be sitting around singing Kumbaya. So within the Democratic Party, there's two factions, the moderates and the progressives. The moderate Democrats want to focus on economic issues. They're more concerned with how do we attract white working class voters in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio. So they're arguing that the party needs to focus more on economic issues this election rather than social issues. Nancy Pelosi and Tom Perez, who's the current head of the Democratic National Committee, are more moderate. They're trying to keep the party more towards the middle for this election to attract independent voters. On the other hand, you do get the progressive Democrats who are considered a bit to the left of the party. And they argue that we have to talk about poverty. We have to talk about health care. We've got to talk about student loan debt, the environment, and so on. Two of the leaders of this wing are Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House of Representatives. They've argued we need to pass environmental regulations like the Green New Deal, increase the minimum wage, create universal health care plans, deal with the cost of student tuition, make college lower cost or even free in some cases. They argue that we have to look at the social issues as well. That it's not enough to talk about the economy. So there is some fighting within the party and was for the primaries. There were a lot of candidates running, and at one point it looked like Bernie Sanders might get the nomination because of how many candidates were running. But the DNC convinced some of the less viable moderates, including Pete Buttigieg, to drop out, essentially make it a two-man race between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and then Joe Biden won. So there are Democrats in the leadership positions who say we need to run a moderate and we need to stay towards the middle. And you've got people like Bernie Sanders saying that that's not how we're going to get voters. If you stay in the middle, how do you get young people out to vote? And there's a valid point to that, right? A lot of young people went for Bernie Sanders, and it's like, if you're not going to be talking about these issues, how do you expect them to show up on election day? So there's a lot of back and forth right now between both sides over which way are we going to go. Are we going to be moderate? Are we going to include the progressives? Are we going to stay to the middle? How are we going to do this? It's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon because there are a lot of progressive candidates running for office. And if more progressives win this time, the party's going to figure out how to talk to them because they can't just ignore them. On the other side, with the Republicans, we're seeing that fracturing between moderates and conservatives who still sometimes call themselves Tea Party. Moderate Republicans tend to be more conservative on economic issues and moderate to liberal on social issues. They're more focused on the economy, like their counterpart in the Democratic Party. The two well-known moderate Republicans are John Kasich, who is the current governor of Ohio, and Charlie Baker, who's the governor of Massachusetts. So they tend to appeal to a broader base. Charlie Baker is governor of a fairly liberal state, and is located in Boston, which is a pretty liberal city. He's not going to be as conservative as other members of the party. And then you've got the more conservative Republicans who sometimes call themselves Tea Party Republicans. They emerged from the 2010 election, and they're both economically and socially conservative. They tend to believe that you have to be economically and socially conservative to be a true Republican. Some well-known Tea Party Republicans include former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, one of our senators Ted Cruz, and our current Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Patrick may have a challenger in 2022 because he said something he shouldn't have. He said that older Americans were willing to die to keep the economy open. Not exactly something you should be saying. But he's probably going to have a challenger next time. So the party is fighting over ideological differences. Some argue you have to be a true conservative to be a Republican. Others say that pushes people out of the party. If you push moderates out, how do you plan to win? Right? If you have to allow for differences in opinion. And we're seeing also a bit of a split between Trump Republicans and anti-Trump Republicans. John Kasich refused to endorse Trump at all in 2016. There are some Republicans who just don't like him. And so the party may fracture a little bit more because you'll have the people who support Trump and the people who don't. It'll be interesting to see which side ends up winning, especially if Trump does win re-election. We may see some changing of the parties. We're due for another major realignment of the parties, and it's likely going to happen after this election. If Trump doesn't win, there will probably be some infighting about, well, do we distance ourselves away from him? Do we move back towards the center? If Joe Biden loses, then progressive Democrats will be able to argue, you guys sat in the center and it didn't do you any good, so stop ignoring us. Either way, the parties are going to be looking at how do we handle these divisions, because it's not going to be a pretty election. And I think parties are going to have to take a good long look at what they've been doing and if it's still sustainable. It's not helpful, but the parties have become more and more polarized. Democrats have become more liberal than the majority of Americans, and Republicans have become more conservative than the majority of Americans. And a lot of that is because the elections are not competitive. You do not have to move to the middle, and you do not have to compromise if you're guaranteed to win re-election every time you run for office. Only 24 out of 435 House races are competitive. What incentive is there for a candidate to moderate their views? There isn't. They can be ideologically liberal or conservative and refuse to move or compromise. So what we see happening is members of Congress voting with their party 90% of the time. This majority rules. But right now, because Democrats control the House and Republicans control the Senate, nothing is getting done. There are hundreds of bills sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk in the Senate, and he's basically said, I'm not putting them on the floor of the Senate. I'm not working with the Democrats. And Nancy Pelosi has basically said, I'm not working with Mitch McConnell. They're not talking to each other. They're not working with each other. And they're not doing their damn jobs. It's frustrating, because they don't reflect the ideology of the population. I just want them to do their jobs. We're paying for them to be in Washington, D.C. Why should we pay them to sit there and do nothing? Right? It's frustrating because it's like we didn't send you there to play games. We sent you there to do your jobs. Now they're playing games with the Supreme Court. In 2016, when Justice Scalia died, President Obama nominated a moderate justice. Under the Constitution, when there is a vacancy on the court, the president shall appoint someone, nominate someone, and the Senate shall confirm. It doesn't matter when that vacancy happens. Because Republicans controlled the Senate in 2016, they said it's too close to the election, even though it was 9 months away, and they wouldn't hold confirmations until after the election. And now this time, with the death of Justice Ginsburg, we've got Democrats saying, you guys are hypocrites because you said we couldn't hold confirmation hearings until after the election, but you're trying to rush Judge Barrett's nomination through. Now they're playing games with the Supreme Court. Nowhere does it say that you have to wait until after an election to hold Supreme Court hearings. Obama should have been able to fill that seat. Trump should be able to fill his seat. Neither side should be playing games with the Supreme Court. We're also seeing more use of the filibuster, and we'll talk more about the filibuster when we talk about Congress. It is a special Senate power, and they use it to block legislation or nominations. So Democrats are doing everything they can to prevent Republicans from being able to fill vacancies on benches and so on. And so both parties, when they're in the minority, will try to block legislation because they know that they don't have the votes to prevent it from going forward. So they basically just try to block legislation and slow down the process. Right now, they are doing the confirmation hearing with Judge Barrett. I've got Republicans on the one hand talking about what a great judge she is, and Democrats on the other saying, but she's made clear her opinions on these issues, and it's too close to the election, and we can't do this. So it's back and forth and back and forth. In all likelihood, she's going to get nominated by the committee, and because Republicans control a slim majority, she's very likely going to be the next Supreme Court justice. Now, there are third parties that exist in this country. We have libertarian candidates, Greens, communists, social democrats, workers' parties. There's a crap ton of political parties in the U.S. The problem is third parties are seen as a protest movement against Democrats and Republicans. It's very hard for them to get anywhere in an election. And the two parties don't like them. They see the third-party candidates as spoilers, as ruining their chances to win. And there is some validity to this. Ross Perot ran as an independent in 1992. Because he was a billionaire, he could basically buy his way onto the debate stage with President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. The Republican vote fractured between Bush and Perot, giving Clinton the presidency. In 2000, the Green Party candidate Ralph Nader got 3% of the popular vote. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it was just enough to keep Al Gore from winning. Of course, the 2000 election was problematic in a lot of ways, but this was one of the problems. When Ralph Nader was looking at running in 2004, Democrats were basically yelling at him, "Don't you dare take this away from us," which isn't fair because he should have the right to run if he wants to. It is also very hard for third parties to get on the stage. Federal funding is only given to parties that get more than 5% of the national presidential vote. It's hard for a Green or Libertarian candidate to get even 3%, let alone 5%. It can also be harder for them to get on the state ballots because of registration fees or the requirements to get a certain percentage of signatures to get on the ballot. So it's harder for them to get their foot in the door. It's problematic because people might like a third-party candidate, but they know they can't win. And they have to hold their nose and vote for the candidate they see as the lesser of two evils. I have a cousin who's looking at voting for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian candidate, and then he realized he's not going to win in Texas. You can't win here. So now he's like, well, I guess I'll have to vote for one of the two major candidates because otherwise you're basically throwing your vote away. Now, some people will still vote third parties of protest if they really don't like the two major candidates. Most of the time, it's a matter of, to quote Hamilton, hold your nose and close your eyes and just pick the lesser of two evils. Sucks. Let's just be blunt. That really just sucks. pretty much agreed that our two-party system is broken. It doesn't work, it hasn't worked quite a while. How can we fix it? Well, we could adapt what's called ranked choice voting. This is used throughout most of Europe, parts of Asia, South America, and Africa. You rank the candidates based on preference. So for example, we would go in on election day and say maybe Joe Biden 1, Joe Jorgensen 2, Donald Trump 3, and then so on and so on. If a candidate gets 51%, a simple majority, they win outright. If no candidate gets the majority, and there's a runoff election between maybe the top 2, 3, or even 4 vote getters. So it basically makes it so that the winner is elected by the majority. It also guarantees more cooperation between the candidates. Because if you can't be someone's first choice, you damn well want to be their second choice. So you're not going to go after your opponent and call them a scumbag, right? You're going to be more civilized because you want to make that runoff election. You want to be a viable candidate. So you're not going to go after your opponent as hard as you would otherwise. It also opens the door for third parties. In a ranked choice voting system, third parties are viable. They do have a chance to win office. So it would potentially get rid of the two-party system. It would give Greens and Libertarians and others the chance to actually win a seat. It's also helpful because if no party gets a majority in the legislature in these countries, then they have to form a coalition. So let's say hypothetically, in the U.S. Senate, we had 40 Democrats, 40 Republicans, and 20 mixed Green Libertarians, etc. Right? No party would hold a majority, so they'd actually have to work together. They'd have to co-sponsor legislation, create a majority, work together. It's actually a pretty beneficial system. Here in the U.S., we only have it in the state of Maine and in cities like San Francisco, Oakland, Minneapolis, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. We don't use it. It would be a pretty good alternative to our current system. Parties would be more cooperative, third parties would have a chance to win, and it would guarantee that a candidate is chosen by the majority of the people. No more so-and-so wins with 30% of the vote, but they have to get the majority. So it would make it more competitive, more cooperative, and get rid of the two-party system in all likelihood. So it's a very interesting solution to the problem. It has to get more popular before it's an option, but I think it's something we should at least be discussing. So, political parties, there's just so many problems with them. It's not competitive. People don't have an incentive to vote. If you're a Republican in Cook County, which is basically Chicago, Illinois, you're not going to show up to vote. If you're a Democrat in rural Alabama, you're not likely going to show up to vote. Why? It's not competitive. The candidate has no chance of ever winning. Why bother, right? It's inevitable that your candidate's going to lose. It's inevitable that they're going to win. Why bother to vote? You're not going to feel any incentive to show up on election day. We do need to make the elections more competitive. We need to redraw the districts so they're not created by the parties, but by independent commissions that would actually make the races competitive. We need to find a way to increase voter turnout. It's a sad commentary that one of the only global superpowers can't get more than 50-something% of its voters out to the polls. People look to the U.S. as an example of democracy, and if they see people staying away on election day, it's not exactly the image we want to show. We've got to find a way to get people out to the polls. Now, the plus side of today's party system is that the parties aren't controlled by a small elite group in Chicago or New York or D.C. We pick the party's nominees. We pick who gets to run for president, Senate, House, Governor, and so on. So the parties rely on us. They need us to show up on the local, the state, and the national level. They need people to run, people to volunteer, people to help out. So we do have a say in who gets nominated and how the parties pick their candidates. So that is a plus. The parties are still very much controlled by wealthy donors and wealthy candidates who can afford to run. And yeah, people can get involved more now with online campaigning and fundraising. It's also going to increase the differences on policy. If you get Democrats, you get some people who say we need to protect a woman's right to choose, and others who say it's not that important of an issue, how do you appeal to both sides, right? The Republicans, how do you deal with the Republicans who strongly support President Trump and Republicans who think he is one of the biggest mistakes the party has made, right? How do you deal with these ideological differences? And so far, the parties really haven't been able to find a way to do that. The parties are, in my opinion, due for a major realignment soon. It's not sustainable the way they're going on right now. Either way, I think the parties are going to have some changes after this election. If Trump loses, the Republican Party may have some changes in attitude. If Biden loses, the progressive Democrats may be able to take control of the party for a little bit. But we're overdue for a realignment because the system just isn't sustainable as it is. There's too much infighting, too much ugliness, and not enough cooperation. So the system's going to have to change. And I was reading an interesting article that said to possibly see the two-party system becoming a four-party system, where the Democrats fracture into two parties, progressive and moderates, and the Republicans split between moderate and conservative Republicans. This would obviously complicate things a bit. The biggest upside would be third parties would have a chance to win, because you'd have two Democrats and two Republicans running for president rather than one-on-one. I don't think that's likely to happen, that we'd see parties splitting in half that way, but it's possible. Not super likely, but possible at least. Okay, so do you think our current party system works? Our two-party system, is it working for us? No, not working. How many of you would consider voting third party if the candidate actually had a chance to win? It was a fair system, the third party candidate would win. It would definitely make a difference, right? It would definitely have an impact on the elections, especially if we don't like the two-party candidates. 2016, two most disliked candidates in modern history. No real viable alternative, so get screwed. It's not a very good system. Many of you would like to see something like ranked choice voting, where it does require a majority instead of just whoever gets the most votes. maybe. It's not too complicated. Oh, okay. So with the ranked choice voting, Eileen, would you support that as opposed to the winner take all, you don't need a majority system? Yeah, the majority should win. Okay. And for those of you online, would you vote third party if they actually had a chance to win? Yes. Okay. It would be better than the current mess we're seeing right now. Because, Lord, it's a mess. Okay. As a reminder, the research papers are due November 10th. Still a little ways away, but it sneaks up on you, so I'll give you periodic reminders. If you want me to take a look at a draft of your paper, I can do so. You will submit it through Blackboard. I am going to post a sample paper from a student who did very well on the research paper, so you can kind of see what they did as you're working on your book. I have graded the midterm exams. I'm still missing a few from people, so if you have not yet submitted your midterm, get it to me ASAP. On Thursday, we're going to start talking about elections, which is also a fun topic. I'll read the first half of chapter 10 for Thursday. I'll see you guys online on Thursday, and those of you online in person on Thursday. If you have any questions, you can email me or call or text me. I'll see you guys next Tuesday. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute.